Okay. So I'm Demion Clinco, and I am really excited today to sort of talk about loss and what loss means to me, because to me it's really about a sense of place. So in my role as the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation Executive Director, I've had sort of the opportunity to really engage in our community about what it means to preserve or protect a sense of place. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I'm going to talk about some things we've lost over the last 10 years while I've been doing this work, 12 years. And then I'm going to talk about some places in our community that we've lost over and over and over again. So, when I think about how I got involved in historic preservation, I think about my childhood infatuation with SimCity, which was, if you're not familiar, it was a sort of a digital game where you build a city and then you create an earthquake and then you rebuild it again. But I also had the extraordinary opportunity and privilege of growing up in Tucson in a really amazing historic place. My parents had moved from New York to Tucson, and they bought a historic adobe home here. And growing up in that environment really began to shape my understanding of the built environment in a way that I had not really, wasn't intentional and just sort of permeated. And I was really attracted to live in really beautiful places, and I was really fortunate to find amazing places along the way, even though I didn't necessarily realize their significance or architectural importance at the time. So these are just some pictures of the places that I have lived. I grew up in Fort Lowell, the Fort Lowell neighborhood in Tucson, and my family was a part of a group that worked to save the San Pedro Chapel when I was young. I lived in Parma, Italy. I worked at the Guggenheim in Venice. I lived in Milan, and this was the view from my apartment onto the train station, which was an important building built in the fascist era by Mussolini. I lived by pure chance in a home designed by Richard Neutra in California, and I went to Occidental College. And at Occidental College, I really saw sort of the transformation of community in two different ways. And I'll talk about that in a second. The other sort of a major thing that happened for me was this building. And while I was in college, I'd come back to Tucson, and there was this huge community discussion and debate about this building and this block and whether it should be protected or preserved. And I happened to be walking downtown when the Thrifty block was torn down. It's now where the building that houses Hexagon is located. And it sat vacant for over a decade after it was demolished. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But when I was walking by, were starting to tear it down, and this is the only photo I can find of it, but the facade fell off, exposing this beautiful Art Deco cast concrete fenestrated building. And I was like, how is that happening? In California, when I was living there, Pasadena, so Occidental College is located right between Glendale and Pasadena, and both of these communities at like 1999, 2000 were really going through a renaissance and sort of transformation and sort of a re-urbanization or new urbanization. In Pasadena, and this is not a completely fair equivalent because the economies of these places are very different, but the general gist is here. In Pasadena, they really identified the historic resources as the key catalyst to transformation and reinvestment into their downtown. And in Glendale, new urbanism was the model, which was like, let's tear it down and build something to look like a town. And they literally have to put the word wow on the building, and there's nobody in the picture, while in the Pasadena model, it's actually full of people on the street. Again, this is Pasadena. There's a real fabric and dynamism in the sort of wondrous quality of old buildings. And this is from Long Beach, which is just like Glendale. And again, it's, the sort of tear it down and build sort of the urban center. So these, I'm going to show first, I'm going to go very quickly through a series of buildings that were torn down in and around downtown Tucson a little bit over the last 15 years. And I put them together, and this is only a sampling of the buildings that have been torn down, because I get told all the time, we can't save everything. Well, I start to wonder when you look at these photos, are we saving anything? This was the Talk of the Town building that I was talking about earlier, and the Thrifty block. It was built in 1910 to 1930. It was on Congress Street, and it was demolished in 2004. It was sold. It was demolished at a cost of $500,000, and it was sold to the developer who left it vacant for over a decade for $100. This was the 4th Avenue Underpass. It was individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It was built in 1916. It was demolished in 2007 to make way for the new underpass. And actually, it was really demolished to make way for the development next door, because the original plan had actually conceived of this as a pedestrian entry. This is the Sanjin warehouse. Some of you may or may not remember it. It was right at the underpass of 6th Avenue. It was originally the Corbett Tin and Paint Shop. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, built in 1930, demolished. This was the building next door. It was a 1948 warehouse, also listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It had been an arts space, demolished. This is the Small Planet Bakery at 48 East 6th Street, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, demolished in 2015. This is the Vance Brothers Bakery building, designed by Josiah Jostler, demolished last year to make way for a new transportation project, built in 1932. This was the Santa Rita Hotel Edition. It had been covered in stucco, but all of the form and building and fenestration was still just underneath this very thin layer. It was designed in 1917 by William Curlett and Sons, the same architects who built Hotel Congress and the Rialto block, demolished in 2009, 2010 for the new TEP building, and it's where their parking lot is now located. Park Avenue commercial buildings, built 1929 to 1950, again designed by Josiah Jostler on the corner, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, demolished in 2017 for the Mark on Broadway. This is the sort of recently known as the Plush Bar. It was recently torn down in 2019. Actually, it says anticipated. It was actually torn down in 2019. It was originally the Lim Yu Company grocery store, built in 1924, an Adobe Chinese market, torn down this year. This is the Southwest Sash and Door Company, built in 1923 to 1930. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, also known as Maloney's. Its demolition is anticipated by the end of the year or early next year. So what does loss of place sort of mean to our community, and what does it mean to America? And I think that's sort of what I wanted to sort of ruminate on this morning. One of the things that I've noticed in my work is that we as an American culture have really begun to treat architecture as a highly disposable commodity. And when you travel the rest of the world, there's a real acknowledgement and recognition that buildings matter. They're part of a sense of place. They're part of an identity of a place. You travel to Italy and the buildings, are new that were built 400 years ago. So what is it about our culture and our community that we keep tearing it down? This is a picture from 1880 of downtown Tucson. These are Sonoran Adobe flush-front buildings. This is really the traditional vernacular architecture of northern Mexico. Incredible dense urban fabric. And I'm going to show a few pictures from this period of this type of architecture. I mean, these buildings, were really designed for the incredible climate here. There wasn't a train. They were built with local materials. They even have mud roofs. You can really see them in these photographs. You can see the plaza in the middle. Tucson was really a crossroads of sort of architecture coming up from northern Mexico and then coming across the United States. Again, this is sort of the streetscape that existed 100 years ago in Tucson. And it's hard to believe it was only 100 years ago, because we've come a long, long way since that. There are fragments, of course, of this that survive in El Presidio and Barrio Viejo, but the entire urban fabric of the city was this type of architecture. So we got tired of that by the turn of the century. So that was 1880, and by 1900, we were like, ugh, we don't want that anymore. And an architect came to town named Henry Trost, and he had studied in the office of Louis Sullivan, and he brought with him this Chicago school style. And it was really sort of this new American style. And so, that old Adobe architecture from Mexico, that was something we didn't want anymore. It had fallen out of taste, and what we wanted was like this new American style. And so the buildings that he started to build, this was on Stone Avenue. This was actually an Adobe building underneath, refaced to look like something from the Chicago school. This is the Gould building, designed by Henry Trost. I have another picture of this. This was one of his banks on the corner of Stone and Congress Street. His school, the Holiday School, where Tucson High now sits. This was the Legal Tender building. What's interesting about this is that, again, so now then we're moving into the next phase, so now 1930s, 1940s. This architecture is looked at as passé. We don't want this anymore. What we really want are things that are simplified. We want elegance, we want modernism. So here's this building before, stripped of all of its character, because this is the new commercial value that we value. That ornamentation, all of that older look, we want to get rid of. So here's another example, and I'll come back to this area. This is actually part of the urban renewal site, which I think is also sort of a fascinating exploration into community transformation. The Cathedral of Tucson. built at the end of the 19th century, a brick building in a Gothic revival style. We didn't love that so much, so we covered it in Spanish revival in the 1920s. But the building wasn't big enough, so then we tore down the back, only keeping the facade. And then I'm sort of jump back and forth between that and then the sort of where the Talk of the Town and the Legal Tender building was. The Plaza Theater, it was Tucson's Mexican language theater, built by Roy Place, who today we consider one of the great 20th century architects of Tucson. He designed the courthouse, the Roy Place building on the corner of Pennington and Stone. But we didn't really like that by the 1950s. By the 1950s, we were tired of the Spanish revival and we really wanted to move towards modernism. So downtown, we started to tear down those buildings and replace it with sort of fun, zany, mid-century buildings. And these are some pictures of that, some of those designs. So we started to tear down those early 20th century commercial buildings and replace them with places like Garcia Cleaners, still locally owned, still the dynamics of the community. This is a picture of the whole downtown site, and what I love about this photo is like everything at the base. So let's see, can I get this to? So in the middle here, you can see a little park, and that was the original plaza. Remember in the first picture where we had the little church and there was the plaza? That was the plaza. And everything around it was all of these layers and layers and layers of the history of our city. So we had adobe buildings, we had the Spanish Revival buildings, we had the Henry Trost buildings, we had these modern buildings making their way into our community, but that wasn't good enough. We needed a new metropolis because all of that was viewed as antiquated and old. And if we were going to be a 20th century city, we needed to clear the way. So we began a civic project of acquisition and demolition, which was known as urban renewal. You can see the park in the forefront, and you can see the demolition occurring in the rear for the TCC. So that photo, that color photo of all of that urban fabric is now just being completely wiped away for urban renewal. And this is what we replaced it with. So this was designed by Garrett Eckbo. The landscape was designed by Garrett Eckbo. The buildings by some of Tucson's most prominent architects of the day, Bernie Friedman, Fred Joe Bush, Kane Nelson, and Wares. But I want to point out the building on the right. So this is, and today we actually are starting to think of this in a much more critical way, that this is actually a sort of interesting examples of regional architecture, of an expression of the architecture that was responding to the environment. On the right was the La Placita site. So again, this was where the theater, the Mexican language theater had been, which we tore down, which had torn down adobe buildings that had been there before. And then we tore them down to build La Placita. This is what La Placita looked like, built in the 1970s. 1972, 1973, it was really, when we look at it in a critical form, it was really sort of late modern, early postmodern design, very much inspired by the work of Luis Barragan in Mexico City. And of course, this year we tore it down. 30 years later. We seem to be on this 30-year cycle of a community. And what are we building in its place? This. On the cathedral site, this next to the cathedral had been the home of the territorial Congress for Arizona and the governor's office. This was actually the home of the seat of the state, and it actually was in those buildings on this corner. Torn down in the 19 teens for new adobe infrastructure for the cathedral, and now it's been torn down and replaced with this. So I'm going to park that idea, and I'm going to look at another site in our community that I think has gone through a similar transformation, the El Conquistador Hotel. So does anybody here remember, anybody actually ever see that building in person? A few people. So the El Conquistador Hotel was built, it was an idea of sort of new sort of suburban investment in our city. It was funded by the actual people of Tucson. They came together and they all had public offerings and there were shares, and everybody chipped in to build this new fancy resort on the edge of our city that would attract tourists. It opened in 1928, not such an auspicious year and for the economic future of the hotel, but it was built in the Spanish Revival style, designed by Annie Graham Rockefeller, a really magnificent building. The interiors were extraordinarily opulent with beautiful furnishings, all to sort of evoke this new feeling and design of what Tucson should be. in the 1920s. A mall was built next door, so the two existed concurrently. I couldn't find a good photo of the two concurrent, but there was an open-air mall, which I'll show a few pictures of, designed again by some of the best mid-century architects of our city, and the mall and the hotel. The mall needed to expand, and so the hotel had to go. So this is a sort of a graphic of the open air, some of the open air mall. This is a rendering by Nick Keller, and this is pictures of that open air mall. So again, wonderful shopping. It was the first suburban real shopping center outside of downtown Tucson. As the mall started to expand, they enclosed the roof. It stopped being open air. It's interesting that we're in a mall today that's actually sort of seems to be going through this entire sort of pattern. So they tore down the El Conquistador Hotel to build the new Levy's, and that was 40 years of Levy's, and then we tore that down to build this. So this sort of idea of where are we going as a community. I don't have the answers. I know that this is not a good model for a future. I'm deeply concerned that we are not actively engaged as a public in saying that these are places that we should be protecting and that we should be saving. We've been spending all of this time tearing down things from the early 20th century, and now we're starting to tear things down from the late 20th century, because this seems to be the cyclical nature. These are just a couple highlights of 4 major buildings that were torn down in the last year and a half. This was the Beau Brummel Club, Tucson's oldest African-American social club. It was on Main Street. It was designed by Arthur T. Brown, who was an important regional master modernist architect who pioneered early passive solar design, built between 1954 and 1956. Demolished to make way for a lot for redevelopment. This was the University Christian Church on 2848 North Mountain Avenue, designed in 1961 by Charles Cox, torn down for student housing last year. This is Walter Douglas Elementary School on Flowing Wells Drive, built in 1961 by the architectural firm of Shavers Company, which was actually a Midwest-based architecture company. It was about sort of this progressive eye of like pods and sort of innovative educational engagement. They'll save one, maybe 2 of the pods. The rest are headed to the dumpster. State Hardware Building on Speedway Boulevard, 1963, designed by William Wild. One of the best mid-century open storefront designs in the country. It's now that. So where are we going as a public? Where are we going as a society? Where are we going as a city? And do we need to do something different? We talk about creative mornings. The creative thinkers of our city, I hope, are here. A new generation of young, creative, dynamic thinkers who can start to think about how can we start a different dialogue about these places and their potential value, or are they an asset? Are they a liability? And I just wanted to sort of end. So it's just good thing I didn't actually die. I wanted to sort of end with this picture because I think there is sometimes glimmers of hope out there. And I love this photograph. This was a building in the downtown urban renewal site, demolished in 1970, 1971. But it wasn't actually demolished. A family here in Tucson, the Rawlings family, Kelly Rawlings was a sort of a pioneer of preservation in the barrio. And when this building was being taken down, he sent a team of people out to number the stones and put them in a pile. And they are waiting for reconstruction. And his children have actually hired an architectural firm to explore the reconstruction of that building. And I think probably in the next 4 to 5 years, we will see this building come back. So sometimes I think there are ways of re-engaging the past. That pile of stones gives me a little bit of hope about what we might be able to do as a city. Any questions? Yes, from the back.
So you mentioned a lot of the things that were torn down that were actually on the National Register of Historic Places. What measure of protection does that actually give them?
So in Tucson, the National Register of Historic Places provides no protection. It provides an economic incentive for redevelopment. So if you have a commercial property and it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, you can get 20% federal tax credit on the total cost of rehabilitation. And if you are a owner-occupied, if you are the owner of a owner-occupied residential property, you can get about a 50% rebate on your property taxes annually for 30 years. In the city of Tucson, there are 5 areas that are actually protected under local zoning, which is Armory Park, West University, El Presidio, Barrio Viejo, and Fort Lowell. Downtown proper is part of it had a special designation that was called the Rio Nuevo area, which is not the Rio Nuevo Tax Increment Finance District. And properties in there are supposed to be taken into consideration, but the march towards development and economic progress cannot hold the gates on these buildings. You know, I think eventually, wherever we see the streetcar, we will see more and more intense pushes for higher density development. We've already seen, as a community, sort of an erosion of that. We see it at the Trinity Church site, which was in the heart of West University, one of the oldest protected zones of our city, and the mayor and council carved a donut hole in the middle to allow for development that was inconsistent with the standards that were set up to make sure that there was context-sensitive design. So National Register doesn't actually protect anything in our community. Another question.
Building code.
Yes.
Right now we're in the 2018 International Residential Code, which affects commercial. Architecture is more of a facade than something structural. And we will continue to have building codes manage and control ingress, access, use of building. How can this be brought into what you're talking about?
So this is a perfect example of how the building code affects the long-range value or preservation of a building. This was purchased by the building next door, which was a veterinarian clinic, and the veterinarian clinic wanted to expand into this space, and they actually wanted originally to use this as their lobby. But because they were making such significant changes to their building, it was considered a full change of site, which meant the entire property had to be brought into code. And because there was not enough site parking, the city required the demolition of this building. So the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation, the organization that I lead, we went to the city and we said, look at these buildings that are being torn down. This is unacceptable, and it's unacceptable that the city is mandating the demolition. We need to create tools and at least a system to work around this. So we've been successful in getting the city to agree to begin to do survey work across the city, specifically looking at 20th century, late 20th century, mid-century buildings to understand what we actually have. Because none of these buildings are flagged, none of them are identified in any sort of formal government database. So when somebody goes into development services, this building is treated just like any, block land building in our city. And it's not treated with any special character or consideration. And so hopefully through something like that, we can begin to actually create incentive tools to help protect and preserve and make sure that things like this aren't torn down. Yes?
When we go back to the very first pictures of downtown, we actually see a level of residential density we still haven't achieved again. And so how do we, and that's where you see the urban vitality, is street level residential density. What's your suggestion for preserving historic character while getting people to actually live in these urban places again?
Well, I think when you look at the historic neighborhoods surrounding downtown, those are some of the densest neighborhoods already in our city.
They're still not as dense as 1880.
They're not as dense as 1880, which is, that was so dense. And it wasn't just residential. The zoning code was not the same. So it wasn't like it had to be residential here, it had to be commercial here. Everything was mixed together in sort of a cacophony of use, which created sort of that dynamism of the urban place. And today we are so regimented in terms of, let's put housing here, industrial here, commercial here. These things are non-compatible. And I think we as a community really need to start grappling and thinking about form-based code. Again, I certainly support density, and I think we need a denser city, but we shouldn't do it at the cost. When you drive around our community, one thing that we have is we have a lot of underutilized land.
Yeah.
And even when you drive around downtown, there are dozens and dozens of empty lots that still sit vacant. Each and every single one of those lots remain vacant because they are complex, expensive problems to fix. They have a cemetery under them. They have environmental issues under them. They have, major plumbing systems or sewer systems under them, and all of those things have to be remediated and fixed. And we expect everybody to take care of all those environmental issues, but we have no expectation around the historic resources. We don't say integrate them into your project, integrate them into your plan, make your plan context sensitive so that it really becomes something that people in 30, 40, 50 years will actually advocate to save. And we're just not doing a good job. My other hope is that maybe with the new council administration, one of the things that gave me real hope was in the platforms of our mayor-elect, there was the call out for urban design standards, some actual design standards to help shape the future of this city. So we don't just have one, bland stucco box strip mall after another. Because what we've done is in Tucson, because of our lack of design requirements, we've created a formula for investors that it's just the lowest possible denominator. They are looking for a delta of what's the lowest, cheapest product that they can deliver that people will continue to pay for. And we as a community start to have to hold the development community, I think, to a higher standard so that we get high quality projects that really integrate into our neighborhoods and into our communities. So we end up with something wonderful. Any other questions? Yes.
How can people also feel passionate about this and get involved on a long-term basis?
So you can sign up for our organization at preservetucson.org. That's, and you can stay up to date on the things that we're working on and volunteer opportunities with different programming. Throughout the year as we sort of work on things, when we have like a major preservation alert, we'll send things out. I think especially because of these things around survey and around the design standards and the building code, I think in the next 1 to 2 years, we're going to see sort of our organization pushing harder than ever. The political climate is changing in our community. Things swung very, very far to one side during the recession. There was such a desperation for any sort of development that we were willing to compromise everything to get something constructed. And now I think things are sort of starting to swing back in the other direction. And so now I think is the time to really push. But I think that currently, all you have to do is go downtown. We are in this transformational period again, without a doubt. If you look at these moments of major transformation in our city, from the Adobe to it was this boom bust cycle, and we are definitely in the boom era. You just walk down Main Gate, you will definitely see the boom era. It's like, dorm town. We went from mini dorms to maxi dorms, and it has changed the character of Midtown significantly. For good or for bad, we'll find out. But I'm definitely concerned that we're allowing these massive developments without the requirement for investment into urban space, into open space, into public space. In fact, many of those projects that are in the Main Gate, those huge towers, they counted the square footage of their balconies as part of their investment into open space. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, so there are a number of allies in the public sector. I think there are a number of members of our city council really are concerned about this. They live in our neighborhoods. They really are elected by the people for the people. But it actually they have to hear from the public when these things are coming up, and when these buildings. It's like what's crazy. Like this building to me is such a frustration. This was something that was really talked about a lot, not just in Tucson, but sort of nationally as such a great example of mid-century modern design. And, we weren't notified, our organization wasn't notified until the demolition permit was pulled, which was 2 weeks before that building came down. And so we contacted the owner, we contacted the construction company, we said, could we have it dismantled? And they came back and they said, well, because we're already in contract, we can do it for you for $40,000, which would be just the removal of the beams and the window system. It just didn't economically make a lot of sense because for something that was already being torn down to save 5 glue lamp beams for $40,000 wasn't a good financial option. What we needed to do was have been notified 2 years before and been able to work with the owner to advocate on their behalf. And that's where there's a real disconnect. Okay, one more question. Yes, from the front.
Partnerships with developers.
Mm-hmm.
The Gaston Company is a good example. They had a lot of land to do something interesting with, and the Mercado is the only thing that snaps. Anything else that they're putting up there does not have the zing.
I think so. So did everybody hear the question? Yeah. So the question was about the Gadsden Company and the Mercado, and then some of the development that's going on the west side. I think what's interesting about Gadsden Company is they hired, I think, one of the best urban planning firms in the country, which is based in Pasadena, Mole Polyzoidus. and they created a master plan for that site. And they have stayed true to that master plan. So although, what we've seen is during the downturn, they really pushed for using low-income housing tax credits to build the plan. I don't think it happened as they had anticipated. It happened in sort of a reverse order. So the affordable housing came first, and now you're going to see more market rate housing. You're going to see more shopping. They're about to launch their Grand Mercado, which will actually be a major expansion of the Mercado itself, which I think is really in that feeling. And they've committed and they've stuck to their original design and their original plan, and they've never compromised that. We don't have a lot of developers who are in this city who are really leading the way around how to reactivate these places. In Phoenix, it's hard to believe, but Phoenix is the model that we should be looking at now. Phoenix has some incredible developers who've really seen the economic potential to leverage these into places that people want to go. Uptown Plaza is a great example of that. It's on the corner of Camelback and Central. If you haven't been there, you should check it out. It was a really wonderful early mid-century modern shopping center, completely covered with stucco in the 80s, unrecognizable. Developers came in, they worked with the neighborhood, they stripped all of that off to re-expose all of the mid-century modern design. They were able to get both local and some national restaurants and local businesses in who are paying not only above standard market rate pricing for commercial properties in that area, but whose returns are almost double what they were in their previous location. So the businesses are seeing huge returns from being in that plaza, and they just sold the plaza for $65 million. So there's real money in this for developers to be made, but you have to be innovative, you have to see potential, and you have to see that these actually have more value being restored than they do being covered up with stucco. And that same development group is now doing a boutique hotel. They're turning an office building in Central Phoenix, which is sort of a zany mid-century modern design, into a boutique hotel at tens of millions of dollars, that project. So again, it's about finding the right developers and cultivating a relationship with them and making an economic case for why they should consider looking at some of these things. And we have a lot of incentives. I mean, a lot of downtown Tucson, a lot of central Tucson is in the opportunity zone with historic tax credits and different economic tools. We have the G-Plat. I mean, we have a whole array of tools. We're just not funneling it, in my opinion, in the right direction. Okay, thank you very much.